They built the fence on a Tuesday. I remember the precise, metallic shriek of the auger biting into the earth, a sound that sliced through the morning calm like a declaration of war. My coffee cup, halfway to my lips, stilled. From my deck, overlooking what I had always considered my lake shoreline, a panorama of gentle waves and distant tree-studded banks, I watched a crew methodically erecting a barrier. A stark, ugly chain-link fence aggressively severing my property from the water. This wasn't just any fence. This was a gauntlet thrown down by Brenda Mulroney, president of the Lakeside Serenity Homeowners Association, a woman whose ambition for control was matched only by her profound ignorance of its limits. She thought she was merely asserting HOA dominance over a rebellious homeowner. She had no idea she just fenced off her own aspirations, her own little fiefdom's access to the very lake they purported to govern. They didn't know who I was. They didn't know what 30 years as a JAG officer, dissecting contracts and prosecuting fraud, had forged within me. They saw a quiet retiree, tending his roses. They were about to see a meticulously planned, legally executed demolition. The initial letter, slipped under my door, with all the subtlety of a grenade, had been vague, citing unauthorized shoreline modifications, which translated to my kids' brightly colored kayaks neatly stored above the high water mark, and a small, tasteful stone fire pit we'd used for years. Petty. Now, this illegal fence. It wasn't just an eyesore. It was a violation, a physical usurpation of my riparian rights. Rights clearly delineated in the deed to my whole lake lot, a document I knew as intimately as my own pulse. The waves lapped mockingly on the other side of the wire mesh. This wasn't about a fence. This was about a fundamental breach, a line crossed with such arrogant impunity that it demanded not just correction, but a reckoning. My family, my wife Sarah, our 2 teenagers, looked at me that evening, their faces a mixture of confusion and outrage. My son, Tom, kept muttering about how they couldn't just do that. My daughter Emily just looked sad, her plans for summer swims suddenly barricaded. That sadness, that was the spark. Brenda had weaponized bylaws. I would weaponize the law itself. My first step was surgical reconnaissance. The HOA covenant, their bylaws, the county plat maps, the state's environmental regulations concerning lakefront properties. My dining room table disappeared under a sea of paper. Marcus, my neighbor 2 doors down, a retired systems analyst with a healthy paranoia about bureaucratic overreach and an even healthier aptitude for digital archaeology, became my unofficial second-in-command. "They've been overstepping for years, John," he'd said, handing me a USB stick. "Financials look creative. Meeting minutes? Sanitized." He'd already compiled a dossier. The illegal fence on my lake shoreline was merely the most visible symptom of a deeper malaise. Brenda and her coterie ran the HOA like a personal piggy bank and a tool for petty vendettas. The community dock, for instance, was notoriously ramshackle, yet the maintenance fees for it were astronomical. The so-called Lake Cabin Beautification Fund seemed to evaporate annually with little to show for it. Most of the residents in our neighborhood were either too intimidated or too apathetic to question the iron-fisted rule of President Mulroney. Her weapon of choice was the violation notice, a blizzard of fines for infractions as trivial as the wrong shade of beige on a mailbox or grass, exceeding the ordained 3 inches. The fence, however, was different. It wasn't a fine. It was a physical seizure. It was theft of access, theft of enjoyment, theft of property value, and it was built on a lie. My property line, as confirmed by a surveyor I hired the very next day, costing a pretty penny but an investment in the coming storm, extended unequivocally to the mean high water mark of the lake. The HOA had zero jurisdiction there. Their claim, as per a hastily circulated addendum to their rules, an addendum I suspected Brenda had typed up herself last week, was that they controlled a buffer zone for environmental protection and community access. A noble sentiment, if it weren't demonstrably false and self-serving. The community access point was a quarter-mile down the shore, on actual common land. This fence was pure, unadulterated spite, a power play aimed squarely at me because I dared to question the latest special assessment for emergency dredging near her favored lake cabin owners. My inner monologue became a constant stream of tactical assessments. Every HOA bylaw violation they'd ever committed, every procedural misstep, every instance of selective enforcement, it all became ammunition. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. I spent the interim meticulously crafting my response. It wasn't just about tearing down that offensive fence. It was about dismantling the rotten structure that allowed it to be erected in the first place. I cross-referenced the HOA's articles of incorporation with state laws governing nonprofits and community associations. The discrepancies were glaring. Their authority, so flamboyantly wielded, was built on a foundation of sand, of assumed powers they never legally possessed, particularly concerning private property rights along the lake shoreline. The lake cabins that dotted the far side of our small cove, many of them owned by Brenda's cronies, became a focal point. How did they access the lake? Many of their deeds, I discovered through Marcus's diligent trawling of county records, had no explicit riparian rights, relying instead on permissive, unrecorded easements or, more commonly, simply assuming access because no one had ever challenged them. And many of their boats, their prized weekend toys, were moored using docks that, upon closer inspection of permits and environmental surveys, were either non-compliant or outright illegal extensions into the public trust waters of the lake. The waves of indignation I felt earlier were now channeling into a cold, focused current of action. I drafted my first formal communication, a cease and desist letter, not just for the fence, but for their continued harassment and misrepresentation of authority. It was a work of art, if I say so myself, polite, precise, and utterly lethal. It cited specific statutes, case law precedents, and the clear language of my deed. It also included a bill for the survey and the estimated cost of removing their illegal fence. Sarah watched me, a flicker of concern in her eyes. "Are you sure, John?" "She's vindictive." I merely smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "Vindictive people operate on emotion, Sarah. I operate on the law. And the law, in this instance, is a sledgehammer." The beauty of it was that Brenda, in her arrogance, had provided me with the perfect casus belli. She had overplayed her hand so spectacularly that she'd exposed the entire rotten underbelly of her regime. The HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a modest building that somehow always smelled faintly of stale coffee and resentment. Brenda Mulrooney presided, a woman whose floral dress and saccharine smile did little to conceal the steel in her gaze. She opened with her usual spiel about maintaining our community standards and protecting our property values, her voice dripping with false bonhomie. The agenda was packed with the usual trivialities: disputes over lawn ornaments, the color of someone's recycling bin, a lengthy debate on the optimal placement of a new speed bump. My item, discussion of shoreline management policy, Lot 17, was buried near the end. When my turn finally came, Brenda introduced it with a smirk. "Mr. Henderson has some concerns about our new environmental protection barrier along his lake shoreline." A few of her sycophants tittered. I stood, holding a slim file. The room quieted. My voice, when I spoke, was calm, measured, devoid of the fury that simmered beneath. "Madam President, members of the board, residents, it has come to my attention that the structure recently erected on my private property, falsely characterized as an environmental protection barrier, is, in fact, an illegal fence. A ripple of murmurs. Brenda's smile tightened. Mr. Henderson, the HOA has clear authority. I cut her off, not with volume, but with the cold weight of fact. No, Madam President, it does not. I have here a certified survey confirming my property line. I also have a copy of the HOA covenants, which grant no such authority over private riparian lands. Furthermore, I have a legal opinion stating that the HOA's actions constitute trespass, property damage, and tortious interference with my quiet enjoyment of my whole lake lot. I placed copies of the survey and the legal opinion on the table in front of her. Her face, a moment before smug, began to register a flicker of uncertainty. This is irregular. Our legal counsel assured us, perhaps your legal counsel should reread the founding documents and applicable state law, I suggested, my tone still mild. Because my legal counsel, who specializes in property and riparian rights, is quite clear. The fence is illegal. It must be removed by the HOA at HOA expense within 7 calendar days. Should it not be, I will have it removed, and the HOA will be billed for all associated costs, including legal fees already incurred. Brenda's composure was visibly cracking. The tittering from her supporters had ceased. Other neighbors, those who had long suffered in silence, were now watching intently, a new light in their eyes. Now, Mr. Henderson, Brenda began, her voice rising, there's no need for threats. We are a community. We can discuss this. There is nothing to discuss, Madam President, I stated, my voice taking on a harder edge. There is only compliance with the law. The fence comes down. That is non-negotiable. However, this incident has prompted me to look more closely at certain irregularities in the HOA's operations, particularly concerning access to and use of the lake. I paused, letting the implications hang in the air. It appears that several structures, including docks and mooring buoys associated with certain lake cabin properties, may not be in full compliance with county and state regulations. Furthermore, the HOA's claim to manage community access appears to extend only to designated common areas, not to the entirety of the lake shoreline, and certainly not across private property without explicit, recorded easements. This was the pivot. The illegal fence was the catalyst, but the real target was the systemic abuse of power. I saw a few lake cabin owners exchange nervous glances. Their unimpeded enjoyment of the lake, their easy access for their boats, had long been taken for granted, often under Brenda's favorable, if unofficial, sanction. Now, the legitimacy of that access was being called into question. Therefore, I continued, my voice now resonating with the authority I had held back for so long. Pending a full review of all permits, easements, and HOA jurisdictional boundaries concerning the lake and its shoreline, I am also compelled to formally notify all relevant parties that any assumed or permissive access across my property to the lake is hereby revoked, effective immediately. A gasp went through the room. Brenda was sputtering. You can't do that. The lake is for everyone. The lake, Madam President, is a public trust resource. Access to it, however, is governed by property rights and law. My property, my rules. Your illegal fence was the first move. This is merely the legally sound countermove. You fenced off my shoreline. I am simply ensuring all other access is legitimate before it continues. The fallout was immediate and chaotic. Brenda, flustered and red-faced, tried to adjourn the meeting, but the room was abuzz. Several neighbors, emboldened, started asking pointed questions about finances, about the emergency dredging fund, about the selective enforcement of rules. The illusion of her control had shattered. The next morning, I received a frantic call from the HOA's lawyer, a man whose bluster barely concealed his sudden panic. He tried to negotiate, to placate. I was unmoved. The fence comes down, I repeated. And we will need to see full documentation for every dock and mooring permit associated with every lake cabin that relies on access through or near common areas you claim to control, or across what might be considered historically permissive but unrecorded easements that are now under scrutiny. He understood the implication. If their docks were non-compliant, or if their access was not legally sound, their boats were effectively landlocked, their lakeside lifestyle in jeopardy. The fight over my fence had suddenly become a fight over their entire lake access. Marcus, my tech-savvy ally, had meanwhile unearthed a gem, the original master plat for the entire development. It clearly showed that the strip of land many of the lake cabin owners used to launch their smaller boats and access their docks was, in fact, an unassigned parcel that had, through a series of clerical errors and assumptions over decades, defaulted to being controlled by the developer, who then informally allowed HOA oversight. However, the developer had gone bankrupt years ago, and the land status was legally ambiguous, certainly not under HOA ownership for the purpose of granting exclusive access to cabin owners if it infringed on other owners' rights or public trust principles. The HOA had built its little empire of lake control on a void. They had been granting privileges they had no right to grant, particularly if these privileges were now being used to bully legitimate property owners like myself. The illegal fence on my lake shoreline wasn't just an attack on me, it was an act of hubris that exposed their fundamental illegitimacy regarding broader lake governance. The waves of consequence were just beginning to build. The threat of having their boats banned from easy lake access, or their cabin's lakeside appeal diminished, was a far more potent weapon than any fine Brenda could levy. Within 3 days, the illegal fence was gone. A sullen, reluctant crew, hired by the HOA, dismantled it piece by piece, under my watchful gaze. The metallic screech of bolts being undone was music to my ears. The lake shoreline was mine again, the view unobstructed, the waves kissing the pebbles as they always had. But this was merely the first act of reclamation. The second act involved the systematic unraveling of Brenda's authority over the lake itself. I sent certified letters to each lake cabin owner whose property abutted or utilized the ambiguously owned access strip, or whose docks appeared questionable. The letters were polite, almost sympathetic, explaining that due to recent events, the unfortunate fence incident, it had become necessary to clarify all access rights and ensure all structures complied with regulations. I enclosed copies of the relevant sections of the master plat, highlighting the uncertain status of their presumed access routes. I also included information on county permit requirements for docks and moorings, along with a gentle suggestion they verify their own compliance. The subtext was clear: your access is not guaranteed, and your boats might soon have nowhere legal to float if your paperwork isn't pristine. The effect was like dropping a stone into a placid pond, the ripples spreading outwards, creating panic. Suddenly, my phone was ringing. Not with angry threats from Brenda, but with tentative, anxious calls from lake cabin owners. "Mr. Henderson, about this letter, what exactly does it mean for my dock?" Or, "My family has used that path to the lake for 20 years. I explained, calmly and reasonably, that I was simply trying to ensure everything was legal and above board, especially since the HOA had demonstrated a tendency to act outside its authority. I suggested they might want to collectively pressure the HOA to formally secure legal access for them, if possible, or to ensure all community facilities were genuinely compliant and equitably managed. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. I wasn't the pariah. I was the one holding the map to the minefield Brenda had laid. The neighborhood was stirring. People who had previously ducked their heads were now openly discussing the HOA's overreach. The silent majority was finding its voice, fueled by the realization that their own lake access and property values were potentially at risk due to the HOA's incompetence and arrogance. The final act was the public reckoning. A special meeting was called, this time not by Brenda, but by a petition signed by a significant portion of the homeowners, invoking a rarely used clause in the bylaws to demand accountability. The clubhouse was packed, the atmosphere electric. Brenda and her board looked pale and beleaguered. I didn't need to say much this time. Other residents, armed with copies of my letters, their own research spurred by Marcus's discreet dissemination of information and a newfound courage, did the talking. One by one, they questioned the financials, the secret meetings, the arbitrary fines, the preferential treatment for Brenda's allies, and now, the potential loss of lake access for many lake cabin owners due to the HOA's mishandling of the entire situation. The core issue became clear. The HOA, under Brenda's leadership, had expanded its power far beyond its legal mandate, particularly concerning the lake and its shoreline. Their attempt to control my small stretch of beach had inadvertently exposed the fragile foundations of their control over the entire lakefront activities of the neighborhood. The threat of having their boats banned from the lake or their cabin's prime selling point, lake access, nullified, was a powerful motivator. The lake cabin owners, once Brenda's staunchest supporters because she facilitated their often unregulated lake enjoyment, were now her fiercest critics. They realized their access was permissive and precarious, not legally enshrined, all because the HOA had prioritized petty tyranny over proper governance. The discussion turned to the unassigned land parcel Marcus had identified. The consensus was that the HOA needed to either legally acquire it and manage it transparently for all residents, or cede any claim to control access over it. The days of informal, unregulated access for a select few were over. The illegal fence incident had become a symbol of wider corruption and incompetence. By the end of the meeting, Brenda Mulroney, faced with a tidal wave of dissent and the very real threat of legal action from multiple homeowners, tendered her resignation, effective immediately. The remaining board members, visibly shaken, promised a full audit and a review of all HOA policies, especially those pertaining to the lake, the docks, and any access easements. They pledged transparency and adherence to the actual legal boundaries of their authority. The victory was not just the removal of an illegal fence from my lake shoreline. It was the restoration of order, the reassertion of individual rights against collective overreach. My family and I reclaimed our little piece of waterfront. The kayaks were back. The fire pit glowed warmly on summer evenings, and the waves seemed to whisper tales of battles fought and won. But the larger victory was for the neighborhood. The HOA, under new, more sensible leadership, began the arduous process of untangling years of mismanagement. They initiated steps to legally clarify and secure access to the lake for all residents who were entitled to it, not just a favored few. This meant some inconvenient truths for some lake cabin owners whose docks were indeed non-compliant. They faced inspections and the need for costly permits or modifications. Their boats were not technically banned by me, but by the enforcement of existing laws that the previous HOA regime had conveniently ignored for its allies. The fear of being banned had simply forced the issue into the open. The whole lake lot, once a point of contention, became a symbol of resilience. The new HOA president, a quiet accountant named David, actually consulted property owners and legal experts before drafting any new policies. The change was palpable. There was less fear, more cooperation. The lake itself seemed calmer, its surface reflecting a more equitable order. My role as the reluctant warrior faded as normalcy returned. I went back to tending my roses, but everyone knew, don't mess with Henderson's roses, and definitely don't mess with his shoreline. The deadpan sarcasm I'd occasionally deployed in my head during the fight gave way to a quiet satisfaction. They had indeed crossed a line, a very physical, chain-link line. And in response, I hadn't just moved the line back. I had redrawn the entire map. Sometimes, Tactical retaliation is the only language understood. And sometimes, the best way to protect your little piece of serenity is to be prepared to go to war for it, armed with nothing more than the law and an unflinching resolve. The aftermath brought a strange sort of peace. The neighborhood, once fractured by petty tyrannies and unspoken resentments, began to heal. The new HOA board, humbled and wary, focused on actual community improvement rather than power projection. They even consulted me, respectfully, on a proposal for a new, genuinely communal kayak launch, far from my property, on actual common land. I provided input, of course, ensuring the plans respected all property lines and environmental concerns. The lake cabins, whose owners had briefly faced the specter of their prized waterfront access being curtailed, or their boats rendered useless, now had a clear, albeit sometimes more regulated, path forward. Some had to invest in bringing their docks up to code. Others had to adjust their expectations about unimpeded access. The word banned was no longer a threat I wielded, but a consequence they themselves had to navigate if they failed to adhere to the now transparently enforced rules. The illegal fence became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered among newcomers about the time the HOA picked a fight with the wrong retiree. Marcus and I would sometimes share a beer on my deck, watching the sunset paint the lake in hues of orange and purple, the shoreline pristine and undisputed. "You know," he said one evening, "for a while there, it felt like a tactical op." I nodded. In a way, it was. Objective identified, resources assessed, plan executed, opposition neutralized. We both knew the opposition wasn't just Brenda. It was the apathy and fear that had allowed her to reign. The psychological closure came not just with the dismantling of the fence, but with the visible shift in the community's demeanor. The waves continued their timeless rhythm against my lake shoreline, a soothing sound that now carried no undercurrent of conflict, only the promise of peaceful enjoyment. My family, the emotional anchor for my resolve, reveled in our reclaimed access. The whole lake lot felt truly ours again, not just legally, but spiritually. The fight had been intensely personal, fueled by a protective loyalty, but its resolution had benefited the entire collective, a testament to the idea that one person, armed with righteous fury and surgical precision, can indeed make a difference. They learned that day, the hard way, that some lines are inviolable, and some dormant authorities, when awakened, are formidable. And sometimes, the quietest man in the neighborhood is the one you least want to provoke.